welcome back. My name is Becca Elliott D. Moose, and I wanted to talk to you all today about the books that got me into reading. I know that for me, reading has been always such a huge comfort for me. I know there's always been TV shows and movies that I can dive into, but there's just something about picking up a book and reading it and getting lost in the story that's being told to me, whether that's curled up under my covers or out in the middle of a forest or a field. I mean, there also used to be a time where I could just pick up a book on a long car ride or on the bus on the way to school and get lost in a story before some sort of big, huge sports tournament or test at school. It would just calm me. I mean, I can't do that now because I get super motion sick. And I mean, even picking up my phone to read it, I'm like, okay, I'm done. So yeah, reading has always been there for me and I'm truly grateful for it. And today I wanted to share with you some of the books that got me into reading. I'm gonna start with this series, because I actually remember picking up the second book in this series at a Scholastic book fair. For those of you who may not know what a Scholastic book fair was, it was literally the coolest thing on the entire earth. It would come to your school, you would pick books, and also there was just like a table of like little tiny things like erasers and pencils and other really cool like sharpeners and all sorts of other really cool things, bookmarks. Honestly, it was the greatest thing in the entire world. Scholastic book fair, you're the best. But to continue the story, I get this book at the Scholastic book fair, I take it home, I read it, I'm immediately hooked. I realize it's the second in the series. I gotta get the rest of the series. I gotta know more about these characters. And the series is The Amazing Days of Abby Hayes. The Amazing Days of Abby Hayes follows Abby Hayes. She has curly red hair. She is the middle child. She likes the color purple and she absolutely loves to write. She has a purple pen and a purple journal, which when you open up the book, there's not only the story of Abby Hayes, the actual narration of what's going on in the book, but you have journaled bits of the story in the book from her own little tiny perspective of what's going on, and it is written in purple pen. And let me tell you how influenced I was by this girl to go out and get a purple pen, a purple journal, and to write in that journal all the time. When you're reading these books, you follow Abby through different situations where she feels that she's inferior to everyone around her. However, she's so caught up in that she actually doesn't see how much other people around her are envious of her gifts. And it's this constant battle of her kind of comparing herself to others and not seeing her own gifts in between. And then throughout the book, learning that she actually needs to look within to her gifts and to really appreciate herself for who she is. So I'd say that's a pretty good message for a kid to be reading. And also being influenced to write more and read more. Great job, Abby. The next book that really helped me to want to read more is The Hobbit. I absolutely love Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. The fantasy, the story, camaraderie, the outfits, the salted pork, really everything. I truly adore Lord of the Rings. And The Hobbit is where it started all for me. And reading The Hobbit and then Lord of the Rings, it was really my first taste of like a hyperfixation that was brought about by a book. And The Hobbit was really my first step into really enjoying fantasy. To use my imagination to imagine these things that are being read to me, these monsters, these people, these beautiful people, the landscapes that are being described. The Hobbit was my first taste of that and I was hooked immediately and I can't get enough of it. I love reading books and reading the author taking you through what they're imagining in their head and then explaining it so that you can imagine it in your head. It's just so cool. The next set of books that really got me into reading, and they are two separate series but written by the same author, is Anne of Green Gables and Emily of New Moon. Both series were created by Lucy Maud Montgomery and take place on the Canadian province of Prince Edward Island. Tiny little place. Also red soil. It's pretty cool. I like it there. There's potatoes. And both stories captivated me as a child because Anne and Emily were two young girls who were so passionate, so free-spirited, and really just loved to live in their imaginations. I really felt reading these books that I was connecting to two girls that really understood me. They were both on farms, and I grew up on a farm. They both kind of had these little quirky imaginations. And as a kid, growing up on a farm where there weren't many people around to be your friend, you kind of have your imagination as your number one best friend. Anne and Emily also read books themselves, which I really felt influenced me to read more because I wanted to be like these girls. I wanted to ask questions, I wanted to be curious, and I wanted to live in my imagination for a little bit and to grow it more, to read more stories so that I could come up with more worlds in my own little world. I think that makes sense. Basically, just have more ideas to fuel my imagination little palace thing in here. Shh, I'm going to my mind palace.
Get out, I need to go to my mind palace.
Another book that had a huge influence on me reading more was Hey God, It's Me, Margaret. At the time, this book was huge for me. It was like reading a story of what I was going through. I mean, this book is the story of a young girl going through changes to become a young adult. The awkwardness, the questions, the anxieties, the constantly trying to figure out what your sense of self is. Like, I mean, I would never want to be 12 ever again. That was not a good time. Not a good time at all. And I remember reading this book, and I think it was the first time where I kind of realized that sometimes stories aren't for you to just dive into and to lose yourself in, but they're also a way that we can reflect what's going on maybe in our lives by reading a story about somebody else's life. And yes, at the age of 12, I wasn't actually thinking that verbatim, but I know it was a feeling that reading a lot of stories, I could figure out what my ideals were, what I thought about the world. Just having somebody else's story there to empathize with could make me understand what was going on in my own world. And sometimes I also read a story and maybe I can't empathize directly with what the person is going through in the story, but I know somebody that is going through that. And reading it helps me to understand how I can help support them and to empathize with them more. I guess that's what reading sometimes does for me as well. By reading lots of different types of stories, I'm able to empathize a lot better with the world around me because I have an understanding of somebody else's heart. And the final book that I'm going to talk about today that got me onto reading is James and the Giant Peach. James, he's an orphan. He goes and lives with these awful people. He hates it there. And one day he grows this magical big peach. And inside the magical big peach are a bunch of insects. All sorts of different insects, including a spider. It's literally the only spider in the entire world I am not afraid of. I would want this spider to be my guardian as well. That's how much I love this spider, and I don't like any other spiders. Just this spider. Anyway, all the insects and James want to go to New York City because that's where opportunity is. So they cut out the giant peach and they have an adventure sailing across the Atlantic Ocean. And then, spoiler alert, they find happiness in Central Park. But this story in particular is on my list of books that got me into reading because it actually was a book that I challenged myself to read. So getting a little personal here, I actually had a really hard time reading as a kid. Not that I didn't have this desire to read, I really liked reading and I loved stories, but I had a really hard time reading out loud. I had confidence issues in the way that I pronounced words, and also it was really hard for me to actually read words and to sound them out. I mean, I could read them when I was just reading them by myself and understand what was going on, but if anybody asked me what and how to pronounce any words, it was really hard for me, and kind of still is. I've always had a hard time spelling. I've always had a hard time reading out loud and pronouncing words, and even remembering grammar rules. I've like come up with little tiny systems in order to remember them. So why would I work really hard to read this book in particular? We had different reading groups, and my best friend at the time was in the top reading group. She was super smart, still is super smart, and she was at the top reading group. And of course, at that age, you want to be with your friends all the time, and I wanted to be with her at the top reading group. So I practiced super hard my reading out loud. I would read to my parents. I would volunteer to read in front of the whole class. Even though it was super embarrassing when I got words wrong, I would do it so that I could get better at reading and so that I could be in that reading group with my friend. One day, it happened. My teacher called me over. She said, listen, we're starting a new book today. Do you want to join us in the top reading group? And I said, absolutely I do. I want to join the group. Actually, I probably didn't say that at all. I said, yes, okay. I sat down beside my friend in the top reading group, and we all got assigned James and the Giant Peach. And that's why James and the Giant Peach is on this list, because I worked really hard to get to read James and the Giant Peach with the rest of the top reading group. And really, it was that working hard to read well enough to be in the top reading group that got me into reading, because I just kept wanting to read more and more and more. So I have to thank James and all of his insect friends and the Giant Peach. Thank you so much, man. So those are some of the books that got me into reading when I was young. But I want to know, what are some of the books that got you into reading? Or some of the books that got you back into reading? There are times when we just have enough of reading. I know for me, after university, there were just so many articles to read, so many papers to read, so many pages of a textbook, and it was just a lot of reading, and it exhausted me to read. And I do remember that I got a job at a movie theater on campus, and I promised myself that when I was selling the tickets at the box office, while I was waiting for people to come in, I wasn't going to do my homework or study at that time. I was going to dedicate it to reading again. And it was hard at first, but the series that really brought me back into reading at that time was actually Game of Thrones, which I've read the whole 5 books. And anytime, Mr. George R.R. Martin, you want to finish those, that'd be great. But anyway, if there are any series that got you back into reading after a little bit of a slump, let me know those series as well. That would be wonderful. And that's it for now. Until next time, stay cozy and happy reading. Bye! Have you all seen the movie of James and the Giant Peach? I haven't watched it in a very long time. I really just remember the spider being so freaking cool. I loved her little beret. It was awesome.